Well, welcome if you're just joining us. We're going to get started here as some people trickle in. All right, I think I'll get started then, Karina. So welcome everybody to our series on science communication strategies for changing Lake Superior. This is one of a 10-part series, and today's webinar is titled Crafting a Story, Journalists' Perspectives on Media Storytelling. So we have 4 media professionals with us today who are going to share how we can communicate our science, our projects and programs in creative, engaging, and inclusive ways. We are about halfway through this series, but I want to point out that we have 2 upcoming events, one in late March and one in early April. So the first one to point out is a 2-part workshop that happens over 2 hours one day, 2 hours the next, and that's facilitated by Compass. They use this tool called the message box to help people build better communication skills. And Compass is a really great organization. We're really lucky to be working with them. They support scientists in improving their communication skills. And then our next webinar, it will be on April 6th, and Danielle Shannon, who's a climate science communicator and an adaptation professional with the Northern Institute of Applied Climate Science, or NIACS for short. Danielle will be kind of lifting the veil on some of her experience communicating climate science and sharing her experience with us. So this series is being hosted by both the Coastal Training Program at the Lake Superior Reserve and the Lake Superior Collaborative. So Karina Heim, who's the Coastal Training Program Coordinator, and I, Erin Burkett, we have been working together because both of our kind of respective programs are both committed to bringing Lake Superior coastal professionals and other natural resource leaders together and to provide training and learning opportunities. So if you're interested in either of these programs and you don't know about them, we'll be sharing links for them in the chat and invite you to contact us after today's webinar if you want to learn more or receive more information about our future events. So now we're just going to do the real quick Zoom tour. I know probably everybody's been on at least one Zoom or maybe hundreds, we've lost track. But for today, we're kind of in this typical Zoom space. We are going to ask that everybody stays muted and your video off for the, the typical bandwidth preservation reasons. So that's on the bottom left of your screen. You can just make sure you've got the red slash through those. And then we are going to have you submit your questions in the chat. We don't have that extra Q&A option today. So at any point, if you have questions for the panelists or you need tech help, please put that in the chat. And for tech help stuff, you could also reach out to Karina directly with a message. Let's see, I think that's it for our Zoom reminders. So we're going to start, before our panelists kick off, we have some questions for you, and this will help them kind of get to know their audience a bit before they introduce themselves. So we're going to launch that poll. It has 3 questions, so we'll take a minute, let you answer all the questions, and then look at the results all together at once. So let's see, should be seeing that pop up in a second here.
Just want to confirm folks are seeing the poll.
I see poll 1, question 1. How have you worked with media outlets and professionals? Select all that apply.
I see all of them. I can see all the questions.
I see responses coming in, so I'm led to believe folks are maybe just taking time to read through.
Great. Yeah, there's a bit of reading to do with the polls. So welcome if you're just joining us from the waiting room. We're just starting with a poll on a few questions from our panelists so they can get to know the audience members a little bit more before they introduce themselves. Hopefully you can still participate in that. I wonder if anybody can hear my dog snoring. He's kind of loud. How's the poll results looking? Are they still rolling in, Karina?
Yeah, I think they've slowed down a bit. If you'd like, I can stop and share.
Sure. Yeah, let's see what folks have to say.
Seeing those pop up, Erin, or no?
I guess I'm not. You might have to summarize for us. Sorry, I'll watch the admitting.
It's all right. Well, in response to question 1, it looks like there's a tie for most folks are identifying that their relationship with media outlets and professionals is that they 57% have written a story about their work for a media outlet, and the same percentage have been interviewed by a media outlet about their work. It drops off a little bit from there. A couple folks, though, identifying their media experts or professionals. That might be our panelists, or it might be some others on the call. For the second question, it looks like most folks are finding their Lake Superior Great Lake news from Great Lake specific outlets. We listed some examples in there, but a large number of folks are also getting their news from newspapers and Facebook, and then it drops off a bit. And then for that third question, do you read articles or consume media created by Indigenous writers and communities? 67% said yes, sometimes to that question. 23% said regularly. So with that, I'm going to stop sharing. Thank you for giving us and our panelists a good sense of who you are before we get started.
Yeah, that's really helpful. It sounds like we have a decent amount of experience working with or even writing for in different media outlets. Okay, so next we're going to have each of our panelists kind of introduce themselves, and we ask them to kind of share both the work that they're currently doing and then some takeaways for us or recommendations for folks who are not in that kind of professional realm. So our first panelist is Allison Devereaux, host of the Unsalted podcast. And Allison, you can unmute yourself and take it away.
Okay, great. Thank you, Erin, and thanks everyone for being with us today. I'm honored to be here. I am on the southeastern edge of Lake Huron in a little town called Bayfield. It is the traditional land of the Ojibwe Chippewa of Anishinaabe. So I was a journalist for 12 years working all over Canada, and sorry, I'm just closing, something has flashed up on my computer here. Sorry. So I was a journalist for 12 years and worked in a number of outlets, and I often found the philosophy or sort of the orientation for a lot of news organizations is urban, like the city in the center, and then the region around the outside. And there's sort of this assumption that everyone in the region is pointing their little boat towards this lighthouse that is the city. And I grew up on a lake, so my orientation was always like, what did the sunset look like last night? Or just, in conversation with the lake a lot of the time. And so when I moved home to Ontario, I moved home 6 months before the pandemic, and I was stuck in my house. I didn't have a car. I couldn't rent a vehicle. We were in a complete lockdown, and I couldn't get to the lake. So I moved an hour from the lake. The goal in my life was to move back to the lake. I'm here. I'm excited. I can't get to the lake. So I started doing what anyone basically in captivity would do, which is I started reading books about the lakes. I started watching YouTube videos, and I found there was a lot of information, but I had more questions. And so as a working journalist, I thought, okay, how do you get people to answer questions for you? And like, one of the best ways is to start a little pet project. So my pandemic project has been a podcast called Unsalted Great Lakes, and I bill it as a podcast for people who work, live, and play on the Great Lakes. So the goal is sort of to stitch together the community too, because like I grew up, I can see the lake right now. I grew up not really knowing what was on the opposite side and not really knowing what the communities look like on the other side of the border. So the goal is to stitch everyone together. And I talk to scientists, environmentalists, deep divers. We've had poets. The most recent episode that I put out, this most recent one came out today, and then it's part 2, and part 1 came out last week, and it's love letters to the Great Lakes. So there are poets and writers sharing their experience and what it is they love about the lakes. So I'm always trying to keep it simple because my background is in broadcasting. And I found, I don't know, personally, I found sometimes when I would look at who was interacting with the lakes and what was going on, we have, binational agreements, overlapping authorities or organizations and commissions. And I felt confused by it. And so my objective was to sort of bring people stories that are outside of that. So I might have someone, I did an episode about goldfish in the Great Lakes. And so I presented the expert as a fish expert. And I gave a little bit of information about her, her credibility, but we didn't go too far into, where in academia she sits and which organizations she's worked with. It was just, here's the fish expert and we're going to tell you a story. And I think a lot of journalists and a lot of storytellers will say that the best way to get people to connect with a story is to give listeners like a human connection. And then also I'm finding with the podcast, like to teach people something. And so I've learned a lot from the performance of the podcast episodes. It's so funny to put a podcast out in the world because the metrics are so specific. Like I can see the digital audience it's competitive out there. And I respect that. People have a lot of options and they have not a lot of time. And so I can see that, I'll have this introduction where I've got this theme and, playing a few clips and this is what you're going to hear. And I've got an announcement. And then when I look at the stats, people are just fast forwarding through that. They get to the start of the interview. They decide within 10 or 15 seconds if they're sticking around and they're gone or they stay. And so I guess in terms of what seems to be working really well is for me has been best understood through the episodes that have done really well. And then the episodes that have not performed as well. I might not have time to get to the ones that haven't performed as well, but maybe we can at some point. But the 3 top performing episodes have been firstly, Dusty Cliffman, who is a diver. He lives in Muskegon, Michigan, amazing storyteller. Like he brought us down into the depths. And so many people said, I don't know what it looks like under the water. I'm really curious. And he just brought us there. He could describe the scenes. And he's also a really gifted photographer. So when I shared the photos online, those are compelling. They grab people's attention and then they want to know more. The second most highest performing one is a woman that if you haven't looked her up on TikTok, you probably should. Her name is Gio Rutherford. And she basically collects things on the beach and puts them into test tubes and then makes those into artist books. And while doing so, she has amassed a following on TikTok of 600,000 people. So she makes 1-minute videos about the Great Lakes. And people it's like catnip. People love them. So I contacted her and I said, I want to put you on a podcast episode. And she said, I'd love to. And then I said, did you know there's goldfish in the Great Lakes? I did a whole episode about that. And so she wanted to turn that into TikTok content. So I put her on my podcast and then she made a TikTok episode about the podcast and the goldfish. And between 30 and 40,000 people have looked at that. And part of the conversation with her was saying, are you shocked by this? Like, did you realize how excited people would be about the Great Lakes? And she did not expect this at all. And so I don't know, maybe when I'm done talking, I'll share in the chat how to find her on TikTok because they're really engaging 1-minute, highly educational videos. And then the third most popular episode was about goldfish in the Great Lakes. So there was a woman, a scientist, she came on and she was talking about the research she does in Lake Ontario. And I think that's the sort of thing, everyone knows a goldfish, but maybe people don't know that there's a goldfish in the Great Lakes. So people really enjoyed that episode, partly because it was information they didn't have. So they're learning something, but also it was so easy to connect with her as a scientist because she really let her guard down in the interview. At one point I said, what's it like to be the goldfish lady? And she burst into laughter and she said, my brother said nobody cares. He's not even going to listen to this episode. And then that became the thing that people responded to the most. Like people were saying, oh, I learned so much. And it was so funny when she said this. And so I'm often trying, like I mentioned, trying to form a human connection. And if there's someone who's coming and they're talking about the science, we try to have a spontaneous moment where I was talking to someone about algae blooms and he was like, I said, have you ever thought about writing a campy, some sort of campy film where a blob in Lake Erie takes over a city? And he's like, actually, there's a brewery that has capitalized on this. And he went to his fridge and pulled out a beer and cracked it open and started drinking it. And that's one of those moments where it was completely spontaneous and, grabs people's attention and then they stay for the science. And, I would never ask someone to represent themselves in a way that was inauthentic or, in a way that was not comfortable for them. But I do find if there's a little room for those kind of funny moments, those spontaneous moments or off the cuff moments, that it makes the overall interview a lot more compelling. I have more to say. I love talking, but out of respect for time, I'll pass things back to Erin.
Thank you, Allison. Yeah, and I can say as a podcast, I'm a huge fan of podcasts, and I really enjoy Unsalted. And I think the episode you mentioned with the individual who's collecting beach stuff and interpreting it in test tubes is really fascinating and really intriguing. So yeah, but we do want to move on, but we're going to circle back. So next we have two individuals from Indigenizing the News, Meghanlata Gupta and Sierra Clark. And so we're going to have you, in whatever order you'd prefer, kind of introduce yourselves and share more about Indigenizing the News.
I can go first. Ani Bojo, Meghanlata Gupta, and Indigenous, Bawating and Anishinaabe, Mikanak and Dodom, Mishigaming and Donjaba. Hi everyone, my name is Meghanlata Gupta. I use she, her pronouns. I'm from Michigan. My family lives in Ann Arbor, but I'm currently coming to you from my dorm room. I'm a senior at Yale, finishing up my senior year, my spring semester. So I'm currently in New Haven. I'm a citizen of the Sault Ste. Marie tribe of Chippewa Indians. And yeah, I guess that's really my introduction. Sierra, do you want to introduce yourself too before I talk a little bit about Indigenizing the News?
Mm-hmm. Ani Boju Biidaabankwe, Indigenous, Kichibadong, Sing, Michigamin, and Dojaba, Nishnabek, Odawa, and Da, Makwa, and Dodom. My name is Sierra Clark. I currently reside and am from my ancestral homelands, which is the Grand Traverse region. I'm Anishinaabeg, Odawa, otherwise known as Ottawa, or Ojibwe. I am a new journalist. I'm formerly an aquatic biologist turned journalist, I guess you could say.
Cool. Well, thank you, Sierra. But yeah, I'll jump right into it. So I am a senior here. I also am a journalist, have done some editing work. And Indigenizing the News is a digital news organization dedicated to Native American news, Indigenous news. We don't have, for the entire organization, we cover a wide range of topics across Indian country. There's a few different parts of the organization. One is that we do monthly newsletters. They're around a specific topic usually, such as education or politics, or I did one on spirituality last December. And so those come every month, and you can subscribe to them right at the website. Yeah. And then we also publish original reporting by Indigenous journalists. We share resources like books and other types of digital resources for people. And then we also do newsroom partnerships, which is what Sierra will be talking about. So excited about all of these things. Indigenizing the News really started out as a project that I was doing for a fellowship in summer 2019. I was part of a fellowship program, and for each fellow, we had to do a capstone project that affected our communities. And as part of that, I started thinking a little bit about policy. I was wondering if I should do something kind of law related. But really, the more I looked, I found that so many of the ongoing issues that, my community is fighting against, that my ancestors have been fighting against, my grandparents, my parents, my friends, people in my community, are just so underrepresented and so, they're just not talked about. And there's all these very negative perceptions of Indigenous peoples that still, are very prevalent in the United States. We're not talked about in educational curriculums often. We're not talked about in news media enough. And so really people are getting this very poor perception of people, and it can be damage centered, and also stereotypes, things such as sports team mascots, and, kind of misconceptions and problematic narratives about Native American people still exist. And so this is really, it really grounded me when I was thinking about my project in terms of realizing like, okay, this seems to me to be the most pressing issue, is to really work through that and to really be raising awareness and showing people this contemporary Native narrative. And also, thinking through, all of the things that we've been doing that are just so dramatically underrepresented. And so it's, educational, and a big part of it for me is education. But I found that one of the best ways to do it was through the field of journalism, was through the field of storytelling, largely because, Sierra and I both come from communities where storytelling is such an integral part of our community's survival and resistance. And the telling of these stories has, been, we've fought to do that for so long. And so many Native journalists, across Indian country, across the world, Indigenous journalists are telling these stories in just a new way through the field of journalism, through working in the newsroom. But we have that grounding in our traditional beliefs and our values and in that structure of our storytelling. And so that's really how journalism kind of came into my life. And since then, I've just been very grateful to have so many wonderful people to get feedback from and to learn from. I worked over last summer as a tribal affairs reporter for Bridge, Michigan, which is a Michigan newspaper. And I also now am working with the Traverse City Record Eagle, which Sierra is going to talk about a little bit. But yeah, I've really enjoyed my time so far. I'm only I still haven't graduated, so I'm in that learning process. But Indigenizing the News, I'm just so grateful for the space that we've been able to create with it, and for the people that have given us feedback and have believed in the project and supported it, and read and tell me, oh my gosh, I didn't know about that, or thank you for sharing that. And so it's really something that I'm super proud of. Would love if you subscribed, and I'll let Sierra continue with talking about one of our most recent developments that started in July.
Miigwech. So I graduated from Western Michigan University in 2019 with my degree in freshwater science and sustainability. I had a focus on aquatic biology, and for the last 5-ish years, I had been working with local conservations and lake associations doing water quality analysis and water sampling and compiling the data and creating graphs and really looking at all the small tributaries that fed into the Great Lakes. And as an Indigenous woman, I wasn't comfortable in a lot of the areas. I had a lot of my knowledge pushed back, ridiculed, because it didn't fit a lot of Western academia standards, or it wasn't proven by Western academia. And so last spring, I was kind of like sitting there and thinking, like, what am I going to do with my life? I am an Anishinaabe Biidaabankwe, which means I'm an Odawa woman. Part of my sacred duty is to be a water protector. And that was the reason why I went to Western University, was to learn the Western sciences and to try to help my community. And I was sitting there and I got this call and asked, hey, do you want to join journalism? And I said, absolutely not. I do not trust journalists. I've seen journalists come into my communities, do really what I call cheap reporting. They will go in, get a few quotes, and not want to learn who we are as Anishinaabe people, not want to learn the cultural aspects, the do's and don'ts of coming into Indigenous communities. And I was told to think on it. And so I got to meet the lovely Megan, and we started talking. And so Michigamming Journalism Project was created out of the need for Indigenous perspective in the state of Michigan, because we can't speak on behalf of other tribes. We can only speak on behalf of Anishinaabe people. So it was created for Indigenous journalists to learn to become journalists. And when I say that, like, I had no background in journalism. I still don't know what I'm doing half the time, just kind of winging it. But we really see this need for that perspective. And there's 4 of us now. There's Megan, myself, Katie, and Susie, who are not here today. And we're all Indigenous women. We all have very diverse backgrounds, very diverse education levels. And Susie is the only one who is not Anishinaabe. She is actually Tlingit, and which is a tribe from Alaska. She was born on Lakota land. But we have been working hard to kind of abolish the system as we know it. And when I say that, I mean, like, you can't decolonize an institution that continuously colonizes. So we're trying to change the way that journalists approach Indigenous peoples, talk to Indigenous peoples, interview, etc. And also with like my background in science, last year I went and tested, I don't even know how many Indigenous households for PFAs. I'm sure many of you in the room are aware of what PFAs are. A very dangerous chemical. But I was able to use some of my science background in that. And I think did I hit everything, Megan? Am I just like blabbing now?
No, you're great. You're great. I'm trying to think if there's anything. I mean, the project has been wonderful so far. I think something that I'm sure we'll be talking about a lot with the Q&A and everything, but just learning how best we can integrate kind of our ways of knowing and our knowledge systems and our ways of telling stories within the newspaper or digital storytelling or all kinds of ways, and how that can be so beautiful and so fruitful. So really happy to answer. We're both happy to answer questions, and I think we'll pass it over to Will.
Thank you both. I know I'm already brimming with questions. So when we get to the discussion, I'm sure it's going to be, I'm just really psyched. So yeah, last but not least, we have Will Cushman joining us from PBS Wisconsin, formerly WisContext. I don't know if you want to explain that or not. But yeah, thanks, Will.
Sure. Well, Aaron and Karina, thank you for the invitation. I'm happy to join you all today. Excited to learn more about the Unsalted podcast and Indigenizing the news. And I'm thrilled to see a number of my former colleagues from my extension days participating in this webinar. So that's really exciting. As Aaron said, my name is Will Cushman. I'm a reporter for PBS Wisconsin. Very newly, I'm totally affiliated with PBS Wisconsin. I have been a reporter for Wisconsin Public Media for a little over 2 years now, reporting for a digital news brand known as WisContext. Due to kind of pandemic related issues, there is some internal restructuring going on at Wisconsin Public Media, and the WisContext brand is sticking around, as is the WisContext website. That's wiscontext.org. Those are all sticking around, but myself and my editor, who are the 2 full-time staff at WisContext, have been pulled over to be full-time PBS Wisconsin staff. Before that, we kind of had 1 foot in PBS Wisconsin and 1 foot over at Wisconsin Public Media, or Wisconsin Public Radio. So before joining Wisconsin Public Media in 2019, I guess my path to journalism is a pretty circuitous. I was, I think, like a lot of journalists, and my first taste of the profession came in high school when, on a whim, I joined the student newspaper. And had a lot of fun doing that. and then went to college, went to a liberal arts school, didn't really know what I wanted to pursue, which was a big reason why I ended up at a liberal arts school. But I ended up majoring in geology and got a formal training in geology and geoscience, and I studied volcanoes. I graduated in 2011, kind of in the midst of the Great Recession. Job opportunities were few and far between, and I ended up moving back to near my hometown of Dubuque, Iowa, and I found a job eventually as a newspaper reporter for a group of rural newspapers in Northeast Iowa. And there I was a general assignment reporter, reporting on everything from city and county government action, law enforcement, personality features, and a lot of agriculture related news, and particularly the reporting I did on agricultural issues, which I think inherently, obviously, have a lot to do with environmental issues. Made me realize that I wanted to kind of pursue a career specifically geared toward communicating environmental and agricultural and scientific issues. And so I ended up moving to Madison then, which is where I still live, to pursue a master's degree in science communication, specifically life sciences communication, life sciences being like biology, et cetera. But really, what I learned in that program could apply to any form of science communication, or really communicating any type of kind of complicated, complex topics. And after that, I ended up working for a couple of years as a professional science communicator for UW-Madison, as a science writer for UW College of Engineering, and then for an office embedded partly within UW-Madison and partly within Extension, known then as the Environmental Resources Center. And that's where I think some of my former colleagues who are tuning in right now, that's where I know them from. That's now known as the Natural Resources Institute at UW Extension, which is a division of UW-Madison. Anyway, that's a long way to, I guess, let you know how I arrived at where I am now. So I am primarily a digital reporter. A lot of what I have done for the last 2 years at WisContext, I will continue to do at PBS Wisconsin for our digital news site. WisContext focuses a lot on kind of long-term news reporting issues. So we actually have had a formal relationship with a research institute at UW-Madison known as the Applied Population Lab, which does a lot of demographics research. So a lot of our reporting looks at issues that are in the news in Wisconsin through a kind of long lens, demographic lens, or historical lens, et cetera. And a lot of what we look at is also pretty grounded in science and scientific research, particularly our environmental reporting, climate change reporting, et cetera. Another facet of WisContext, in addition to the original reporting that we produce, we also have solicited and edited and published essays by contributors. If any of you are familiar with the website, The Conversation, it's a little bit, the idea is a little bit of a Wisconsin-specific version of The Conversation, which is a website where academics, scientists, researchers will write an essay, or also known as sometimes an op-ed, about a specific topic that might be kind of newsy or in the news cycle right now. So we do a kind of similar thing at WisContext, where we will solicit essays from researchers on any number of topics that are in the news. I think earlier Sierra mentioned PFAS. That's a topic that we've covered quite a bit at Wisconsin Public Media, and we solicited kind of introductory PFAS explainer from an expert at UW-Madison who could kind of break down the science of this kind of complex set of chemicals and their environmental and health impacts. So that's just one example of that type of work that we do. I will share right after I wrap up talking right now, several links of some examples of both our original reporting and then some of these contributor essays. WisContext is an all digital brand and news service. And what I'm doing at PBS Wisconsin is all digital as well. But we really like to leverage the expertise of our colleagues at Wisconsin Public Radio and PBS Wisconsin and try to create really visually multimedia engaging stories on a digital platform. So our reporting tends to embed a number of videos or audio elements, a lot of visuals. We're pretty heavy on data visualizations. I've basically been a COVID beat reporter for the last year. And one of the main projects that we've been working on is just tracking COVID-19 and its impact on Wisconsin communities through the sharing and kind of dissecting and explaining of the data that local and state health departments share on a daily basis. And I will share some links to that work as well. I'm looking forward to your questions, and thank you so much again for the invitation to join you today.
Thank you, Will. So now we're gonna put everybody in the spotlight here, all of our panelists, and we're gonna move kind of into a discussion and question and answer. So like Karina said, please submit your questions in the chat and we'll get to those as they come in. So we're gonna start with a question that many of you kind of hinted at, maybe Allison to start us off, that acknowledging that the work is challenging, you may not always know what's going to be immediately engaging or catchy to people when you're preparing a story or a podcast or a storyline. So the question is, are there any pitfalls that you or that people tend to fall into when communicating environmental or scientific issues? Any pitfalls that you've noticed? And if you could shed some light on those and provide advice on how to avoid them, that would be probably really helpful to the audience. And I don't know, I kind of put you on the spot, Allison, but if you want to kick us off, that'd be great.
Yeah, sure. No, that's cool. I mean, I think like an ongoing thing that a lot of news organizations have to deal with is how do you communicate climate change, which is a catastrophe, and not catastrophize it over and over again, right? Because then that becomes a way that people that's a way to tune out what's going on, right? And so I know that is, I mean, in my other hat, I am a public radio producer. And so that is an ongoing conversation I'm having, trying to figure out how to tell these stories in a way that doesn't fatigue people too, right? Like if there's a narrative that's in the news for too long, people do tend to get a little bit tired. And so like my philosophy is, and I come at this with the podcast, is there's an assumption that people care. And there's an assumption that they're aware, like there's a certain agreed upon, like the people who are listening to the podcast agree that climate change is a crisis and it's real. So from that place, how can we have nuanced, varied conversations, right? And so in terms of pitfalls, I do, often when I'm booking scientists, and I understand this challenge, I will say, we ask scientists to be the smartest people, and then I'm also going to ask you to dumb this down. And so I appreciate that is very challenging. Like I appreciate that is a complex thing to do when you're in academia, and part of like your worth and what you're putting out there is your ability to communicate, or not your ability to communicate, your ability to think on this level. And then, but I need you to break this down for me, right? And so I'll often say, I'll stop people and say, can you explain that to me like I'm 5 years old? And my kind of orientation when I'm hosting the show is I consider myself a reasonably intelligent person. So if I get into a conversation where it's over my head, I have to stop and say, I don't understand what you're saying. And so constantly trying to mind that. I'll do long interviews, and sometimes, unfortunately, I do have to cut parts of the interview if it goes a little bit too far over my head. And so trying to find a way to weave together a conversation that is both interesting, like has those kind of surprising moments, but also, stays true to the science and the information in a way that, I hope that the person that I've interviewed is as comfortable with it, right? So I think just a pitfall, and I mean, I'd be interested in like a scientist's perspective on this. A pitfall, I think, is going over people's heads.
Or like you started out saying, overwhelming them with maybe catastrophe type information. What about the rest of you? Do you have any thoughts on maybe common pitfalls you've witnessed, or maybe it is a personal experience of a challenge to overcome? Feel free to jump in if you'd like.
Sure. I agree with like everything that Allison just said. I think a really common pitfall that I've seen and that I've been guilty of falling into myself at times is making assumptions about my audience or about your audience, and just like all sorts of assumptions. Including, I think, especially the knowledge that they hold, and also I think there's sometimes an assumption by science communicators that just because they or you are really fascinated or into a topic that your audience will be as well. So I think trying to avoid making too many assumptions about who your audience is, what knowledge and values they bring to the table, and what kind of gets them excited or engaged is a pretty common pitfall. And so I would say you should really, when you're working on crafting a message or a story, really want to think long and hard about who your audience is, and think about not only who they are, but what you yourself know about them, think you know about them, but then also really try to interrogate yourself and wonder like what you might not know about them. I think there's a lot of legwork like that is missed sometimes when people just go straight toward, I need to craft my message and my story, not thinking too much or too deeply about their audience.
I just wanted to add one thing, because both what Allison and Will said were spot on. Numbers. I know that like putting a bunch of numbers or statistics will often confuse people. So that's the only thing I wanted to add, that I've noticed, is to like, if you're going to put it in a statistic, keep it simple. Like, not that you're trying to dumb things down for anyone, but numbers get really overwhelming for readers, because then they're trying to remember like, oh shoot, was it this or this or this? So that's the only thing I want.
Thank you. That's a really good point. And when you're wearing your scientist hat, it's easy to forget, like, you're like, what's the significance value, or reporting the numbers can be what you're thinking about and your bar charts. But yeah, that's a really good point. I can relate because I like numbers. So I guess a question, follow-up kind of for Sierra and Megan. I'm wondering, well, I guess first of all, have you been able to kind of use your position with the Traverse City Record Eagle to influence the content that they put out there? And I'm wondering, kind of the second part of that is, what steps can organizations take to be more inclusive to Indigenous scientists and journalists?
That's a great question. So upon making the partnership with Indigenizing the News and with the Record Eagle stepped up and said that they are going to completely change the way that they view journalism, because unfortunately, but also congratulatory to me, I'm the first Indigenous woman to be in that newsroom, and that was in 2020. So they have step-by-step guide on what they're doing. We're doing anti-racism training. We're doing weekly check-ins, but to answer your question, I guess lightly, is yes. The short time that Michigamming Journalism Project has been around, we have seen not only like stories being influenced by us as Indigenous people, but also the way that journalists are starting to approach Indigenous topics. So rather than lumping us all into categories, calling us Indian or calling us Native Americans, the journalists are now asking in the people that they interview, what tribe do you affiliate with, or how do you want to be affiliated? Because that's incredibly important to Indigenous people. You know, we're not all the same. Anishinaabe are very diverse from Tlingit people. So the main goal of Michigamming is to work with this newsroom, but any other newsroom that we work with, because we have about 6 right now that we're working with. They have to follow our guidelines. They absolutely have to be inclusive. They have to allow us the last editing rights. And that's not because we're like Megan and I are like super controlling. It's because there are some things, like there are some aspects in the stories that are incredibly important for cultural context. And they just can't get edited out. Is there anything that I missed, Megan, that you wanted to add?
No, I think you said it. I think you said it so well. I've written one story with Sierra for Traverse City Record Eagle so far. Mostly I've been on in sort of an editor role and also a consultant role. I would say, yeah, exactly the same thing as Sierra, that, we have really been not only trying to create space for tribal affairs journalism, and also I know Sierra has collaborated with other reporters in the newsroom who might be doing stories about, a range of different things, and that, tribal affairs journalism isn't just like in a separate like area. It's, should be throughout the entire newsroom, and Indigenous sources should be sought out, and relationships should be built for any kind of field of journalism or any subject area or any topic. And that's true, for all people of color. But yeah, I would say, yeah, Sierra, you said that wonderfully. And
just to add, especially in the science community, being a scientist myself, but also now being a journalist, I wholeheartedly believe that Indigenous peoples, tribes, scientists should always be sought for their knowledge, because Indigenous knowledge is science. It's just science with heart. We have lived on this land since time before. We have been stewards to the water, stewards to the land, and you might learn something new just sitting down with an elder and listening to them for an hour or two.
That's a perfect kind of transition to the next question, which is, I was thinking about how can people connect with specific audiences? So one of the questions we had is, if you're wearing your scientific researcher hat, or you're a government employee, a coastal professional, or decision maker, and you have a program or a story you'd like to tell, how would you all recommend, how would you even like kind of bridge that relationship with a media professional to help you reach a specific audience? Because you're out there, but maybe you're kind of a mystery to many of us.
I can start out if that's okay. Yeah, I guess I would say first, just like, do not be shy. Look up reporters who report in your local community, or statewide reporters. Look up beat reporters. Reporters love to be on Twitter, so that's a great place that you can kind of start. Otherwise, just just think about your own media consumption habits and where you get local or state or tribal news, and look up the individuals who are reporting or producing that work, and reach out to them directly via email, and be persistent. You're not necessarily going to get a response from all reporters all the time. In fact, I would say you're probably going to strike out a lot of the time. But that's why I think it's really important to be consistent. And I view it kind of as a similar type of work that reporters do in building and maintaining relationships with sources in the communities that they cover and report about. Like, think about this as you are developing a relationship with a reporter or a media professional. It doesn't necessarily even have to be like a reporter who writes a news story or creates the TV package or whatnot. Think also about, I'm speaking from kind of my perspective as a public media professional in Wisconsin, but think about talk shows on the radio and what you listen to. There are a ton of producers who work on those talk shows behind the scenes, and you can find their information online really easily just by looking up the talk show and finding out who produces for it. All those credits are there, and there's usually contact information associated with that. I can say that producers, in my experience, radio talk show producers, especially for daily talk shows, are like always looking for new topics for segments, and are maybe for that reason going to be a little bit more receptive to kind of cold calling or just a random pitch from someone that they don't know than someone else who might be working on reporting breaking news, in addition to all of the other kind of like feature stuff that they're working on. So I would say be persistent, consistently reach out to people, and also think about how to hook. Think of journalists, reporters, media professionals as an audience that you are trying to reach, and so try to hook them, whether it's with an engaging story or vivid visual, or some other means. Don't just expect that your dry press release or whatnot is going to catch their attention, because reporters are humans too, and we also get hooked by kind of snazzy visuals and whatnot. So don't be afraid to get creative while you're reaching out to people.
Yeah, I appreciate that advice. Allison, did you have thoughts on that too?
Yeah, well, that was great. As you were talking, I was like, yeah, I want to jump in. The other thing with daily news producers or daily radio producers is, you might start the day, here's the 10 stories we want to tell today. Story 1, this person gets sick. Story 2, like, you can move down a list of stories, right? So you might pitch a story and it's not the 9 a.m. story, but 15 minutes to showtime. Okay, what can you give us? So I think also bearing in mind that accessibility is important. This seems like a really straightforward thing, but you'd be surprised by the number of times we get a press release or someone says, "Oh, I've got a story for you, but I don't want to tell you the story," or I'm sending this before I'm clocking out for a 3-day vacation. So actually being accessible it's the kind of thing people take for granted, but you'd be surprised. The other thing is when Will was saying to like be persistent or to make yourself put yourself out there, because sometimes someone might take a pass on a press release you sent. However, journalists tend to know each other. So I might see something and it's not a fit for the particular thing I'm doing that day. It's not a fit for the podcast. Like, I'm not seeing it in our future, but my friend is writing a book about trees, and I'll call my friend in Winnipeg, or and also, like, sometimes the pitches are just so unrelated to what you're doing. If they're like a Hollywood pitch from California, I'm like, okay, I'm not going to do this. But for the most part, if it's a Canadian story, like, I will know another Canadian journalist to call who might pick that up. And I also find, I don't know, I'm in Canada. And I'm in a province that has had rolling lockdowns. And so in the past, there used to be, you know, the story ideas that would come up because you were at the hockey rink or you were at a dinner party, or like you would find stories sort of organically. And now, like, the number one way a lot of journalists are finding stories are on their phones, right? Like, everyone's scrolling. And so I find there's a little bit more pickup for people who are putting themselves out there and saying what they're doing, because journalists have become a little bit more limited in where we find our stories.
That makes sense. I hadn't even thought about that. Thank you. I do see we have a question in the chat, and I want to encourage everybody who's here listening, feel free, we can take your questions. So I'll kind of shift to that. And then if we run out, I've got more on the back burner. So Emma asked, do you have a favorite example of stories or journalism outlets or maybe strategies you would highlight that you saw were great, or you feel were best communicate overwhelming or scary subjects like climate crisis or PFAS crisis in an engaging way? So I don't know if anything comes to mind for any of you, but kind of asking, like, have you seen good examples that tackled those kind of scary or so often overwhelming topics? And it can be your own work if you want to recommend something you did.
I mean, I can add, I think something that I've seen a lot is visual, like, you know, photojournalism, and really kind of visual storytelling, especially because I think, like, right now, I think it's easy to think of some of these things that are happening in like an abstract sense. And like when we see all these numbers and statistics, like everyone has said on this panel, it can just seem a little detached, I guess, from also the human part of it. And so that's a very simple thing, but I think always like the visual part of, you know, whether that's a photo at the top of the article or whether it's really the stories being told by photos, by videos, I think like that has been very impactful for me as a reader. And that's something that I've tried to emulate in, you know, a few of my stories, really think about, okay, yeah, what kind of story do I want this photo to tell? In one of Sierra and I's stories, we were very grateful that a photographer who had taken some photos of some Indigenous women down in Detroit had shared some photos from when they were marching with the Black Lives Matter movement, and that was really good. And I think those photos just showed such power, and I just think that part is a really grounding aspect, and it really reminds us of the very personal, intimate, and vulnerable aspects of all of these issues.
Yeah, thank you. That's really great. That's a really great reminder. So, and I don't know if it was PFAS, and Will, I don't know if you'll remember this, but I think that, is it Melissa Wozniak, maybe? There was a recent PBS Wisconsin like little video about PFAS, I think that was engaging. If I can find it, I'll put it in the chat, but I remember that one being helpful for me. Let's see.
You may be thinking of, or there's so much going on at PBS Wisconsin that I don't even know everything that's being put out there all the time. But you might be thinking of one of my colleagues, Marissa Wojcik, is a multimedia producer, and as Meghanlata was just saying, like the visual element can be really helpful for communicating complex or scary issues. And Marissa has a series called Fast Facts, I think is what it's called. And she did a Fast Facts. It's just like a brief explainer on maybe a complicated, complex topic that's in the news. And she's done them on all sorts of things, including on PFAS, and where she just kind of breaks it down. It's basically like she's a talking head. She has some basic visuals next where she's like standing in front of a green screen. So she has some basic visuals in front of her, bullet points, kind of like this is high level, what you need to know. Here are some common questions about these chemicals known as forever chemicals. This is kind of the current state of the science, and this is the context that you may be concerned about it, and this is kind of, she wouldn't necessarily like tell our audiences like how concerned to be about it, but like kind of providing more information about why scientists might have concerns about the environmental or health impacts of PFAS, et cetera. Another, this is a little bit off topic, but just in terms of an outlet that covers kind of scary, overwhelming subjects, I think really well, an outlet that I think has covered the COVID-19 pandemic really well from a scientific research perspective. It's really grounded in evidence. It's sober reporting, but it's also really engaging, is the online news outlet known as STAT. So that's statnews.com. As a reporter who's been covering COVID in Wisconsin all year, it's been a wonderful resource for me. And I think there's a really wide range of content on there, from just kind of like digital explainer stories about the new variants to podcasts, et cetera. And I can share a link to that as well.
Thank you. So I like that idea that you're not telling people how to feel about something. You're not automatically being doom and gloom. You're presenting them with the facts and information. It's a good reminder. Another question from the chat for Allison is, in a crowded podcast landscape, how do you market Unsalted? I think this is a great question.
That is a good question. And I'll admit, I just sort of put the podcast up there without much of a strategy. And Erin's laughing because she tracked me down on Twitter, and it was a completely unrelated account, and said, is this the same person? Ideally, I would have had a website and this marketing strategy, but I just wanted to start the conversation and put it out there. And so I did put it out there, and it's been interesting because I don't know if people are searching Great Lakes. I mean, I think I have tapped into something that there's like a pre-existing passion for and community for. And so I just sort of put it in there. And people have been, like sometimes people will find me on Twitter or find me on LinkedIn and start where I'm not really talking about the podcast, but we'll start conversations with me there. I do have a Instagram account for the show, and I just post beautiful pictures of the lakes. And so I think, if I was posting a lot about the podcast, that would be fine. But people are more, like you have to kind of play to your audience. On Instagram, what's going to catch your attention is a really gorgeous sunset or a photo of a lighthouse. And there's such a community of really talented photographers that have been generous about letting me share some of their stuff. And so I have the Instagram on the go that has maybe 3,000 followers. What I find is that you can't assume that it will translate, right? Like some people are there for the photos and they just want to be on Instagram. That doesn't mean that they're going to gravitate over to Spotify or Apple, right? So probably the next thing I'm going to do is start advertising in that specific forum so people can hear a little bit of the podcast, a little bit of like how it sounds, and they're already on Spotify, or they're already listening to podcasts, so that can translate a little bit more easily. I find also if you key into a network that pre-exists, like some of the most successful episodes I've had are people that happen to have huge followings, and I do see that bump, right? It doesn't mean that I want a podcast. I don't think we should make all our decisions that way. I don't want every episode I don't want that to be the cost of entry for a lot of the stuff that's being made, is like if you already have a big audience and tapping into that. I have noticed that there will be a bump for that, but then people will stay for other episodes because it's a topic that interests them. So I think it's a sort of a niche topic in like the Great Lakes, right? And so if you tap into the people who are already excited about that topic, then people are going to stick around for a little while. I also noticed a big jump after Christmas. Like someone sent me an Instagram message that said that they got an Alexa, and that I think they just were saying Great Lakes into it. And so the ways that people are finding it are really all over the map. I don't think I could pin it down, but I would say that a huge part of the success is the pre-existing audience. And thank you for your question.
And I think just a follow up. So earlier when you were talking about how you have seen trends with like certain episodes maybe being listened to more than others, or different stories just getting a better reception. Do you have any kind of sense for or takeaways from that experience with what you've done so far? Like what seems to land or hook people in more, maybe besides the who you're interviewing already having an established following? Like, are there other trends you're seeing, or?
Yeah, I think if it's a topic that really interests people, if it's the sort of thing that people might already be interested in hearing about, and then like they really only give it 15 seconds, right? So if the conversation is starting out interesting, or there seems to be like a little energy between myself and the guest, then people are going to stick around. I have made a few missteps. I love Halloween and I like spooky stories. So I did this very complicated sound piece where I had like these spooky stories from the Great Lakes, and I got my mom to voice one of the ghosts, and I got so into it. Like I was just like loving it. I put it online, and it flopped. And I went, okay, people don't want this, I'm trying to make this like artful, complex thing. No, they want straight goods. And they want to hear a connection too. I think that's really important with like storytelling in general, with podcasts. There's an intimacy between two people having a kind of vulnerable conversation, and our ears are becoming more and more trained for that. If you put earbuds in and you're listening to a podcast, that's sort of what people are listening for. I also have posted things for, I had a man cycled around Lake Michigan, super fascinating interview, really compelling guest, great speaker, we had a great energy, and it just flopped. And I think because, if I'm putting it out there as a podcast about the Great Lakes, people want to be on the water, not on the land. And so, it's sort of like, I think especially with podcasts, when you're putting something out there that's hyper specific, you have to stay true to that.
Yeah, I think your example of the spooky episode, that's a great reminder of like, again, what we are really maybe jazzed about and excited about may not translate to the audience interest. So that whole like going back to audience assumptions seems important. I want to make sure we get to one of our questions about maybe if any of you have ever encountered resistance to any scientific or cultural concepts in your reporting. So the question is, just that. Have you encountered resistance to any concepts in your reporting, whether it's something scientific or cultural, and how have you handled that? If you could think of an example. And this is open to anyone on the panel, of course.
I'll start. There was a lot of resistance for Indigenous reporting in the area that I'm in, which is the Grand Traverse area. The first couple of weeks, I got a lot of hate mail, got a ton of ignorant messages, and it hit me down for a little bit. But Michigamming Journalism Project, all the women in there, and Nathan Payne from Record Eagle just reminded me that in order to make change, we have to be uncomfortable sometimes. And it's their perspective that they're really uncomfortable with having an Indigenous woman with a scientific background in the newsroom. It's not journalism ethics or journalism code. Like sometimes we need to change things because we're in 2020 and some of these rules are very outdated. Some of them are just plain racist. So I guess to like really answer the question, being an Indigenous journalist and being an Indigenous scientist, I constantly am fighting to prove like who I am, why I deserve a seat at the table. And the best way that I've gotten through that is honestly community. The elders in my community, the youth in my community, because I'm not doing this for myself. I'm doing this for the next 7 generations so that my great-great-grandchildren can read about themselves through their own perspective and not the perspective of somebody else's. So that's a weight that I'm willing to carry and have the burden on right now, so that they won't have to.
Yeah, I mean, I can add a little bit to that, but Sierra really said it all. I think a lot of times, yeah, it can be difficult for Indigenous journalists in the newsroom, as it is for Indigenous people and people of color in all sorts of institutions and all sorts of spaces. But oftentimes, yeah, the labor can fall disproportionately on Indigenous peoples to be, building those relationships and to be fighting for, oh, I want to have kind of this style of doing things. And so I think it's been, what I've really appreciated is having allyship, and having people who, take it upon themselves to be thinking critically about these things. And Sierra and I are always talking about that, for non-Indigenous people who may not, even for their whole lives, had thought about these things before, now is a perfect time to do so. And there's always going to be mistakes along the way. I mean, we're Anishinaabe journalists, so we are still learning about other communities ourselves and still learning about how we can act respectfully and appropriately with other Indigenous nations. And so there's always going to be, it's always a learning process, but that's okay. It's, always it's okay to make mistakes, but I think where it comes and where that is in the response to those mistakes and how we move forward and hold ourselves accountable. Thinking about non-Indigenous journalists, non-Black journalists too, how we can really just keep holding ourselves accountable and keep learning. And yeah, so I don't know if that's an answer to your question, but it definitely is difficult. And I think too, a lot of times there's such a general lack about Indigenous communities in general, or like about what is tribal sovereignty, like how is this an aspect of tribal sovereignty, or like why is it this history that a lot of the work that I've done in the past is like actually just writing the context in with the story, like, okay, yes, this is breaking news that's happening, but like, let me walk you back for a second of like 300, 400 years of history that I need to tell you to understand the magnitude of this event. So it's about, and this is, I think, a very Anishinaabe understanding of time, but not thinking of these like breaking events and news and writing about them. Yes, okay, this is breaking news, but also contextualizing it within the past, present, and future of our worlds. And I think that's really important, and that's something in journalism that we're really working towards. So that's another thing that we're still like fighting for, I think, actively.
Well, I think the Record Eagle is lucky to have you both and the other two participants in the program. And I wonder whether now or in the future, do you envision branching out, indigenizing the news to establish a similar program in other newsrooms or outlets, or maybe you already are somehow?
So it's a little confusing. So right now we kind of view Record Eagle as a buyer. They partnered up with us back in June and gave a 6-month program, Michigaming Journalism Project. And when that 6 months was done, all of us like graduated. So right now I'm technically a freelance reporter. I mostly work with the Traverse City Record Eagle, but I also work with Metro Times, Detour Detroit, WKAR. I'm working with IPR. So what Megan and I are planning, and the other ladies, I can't forget them. We are branching out Michigaming Journalism Project as like its own organization and entity that we can pull in other Indigenous journalists or multimedia professionals so they can come learn from us, work, and then we can put them in a newsroom. And when that newsroom signs on to bring them on, they have to follow Michigaming Journalism Project's codes and ethics that I had discussed earlier about like anti-racism and all of that.
Oh, thanks. That's a really exciting update. Thanks. I want to make sure, let's see, Deanna, you had a question in the chat and I'm not sure if it got answered. Do you want to, there's a couple things there. Do you want to unmute and explain your question?
Yeah, well, Sierra talked a little bit about how people were responding. which was one of the things I was curious about. And then Megan had also responded to including Anishinaabe in some of our communications. And it's something I think is really important, but I sometimes, I just don't, you don't know if you're doing it right. You just do the best you can. You ask people. Yeah, go ahead.
Oh, yeah, I don't know if you were finished yet. And Sierra, feel free to jump in on this as well. I was just going to say, I think what I've said to, Sierra and I both work with a lot of non-Indigenous people, like other journalists or other, just collaborators in general here at school. I definitely work with a lot of different groups that are interested in getting involved, but not really sure, wanting to be appropriate and respectful and to keep learning. And I think, I love that idea of really prioritizing those place names. I love the idea of really centering Indigenous knowledge systems. I think the thing is just being very open and honest. If you are a non-Indigenous ally, being very open and honest about that, you're not Indigenous, but you are committed to doing these things because we need these things, and that this, journalism is rigorous, and that these subjects are needed to be talked about. And that, as an ally, that's a responsibility of yours, and that's something that you want to work towards. So I think there's sometimes this, I've seen sometimes this, obviously there's white guilt and all these things, but I think the most impactful collaborations I've had or work that I've seen being done is non-Indigenous people being very clear about their positionality, that they're non-Indigenous and they're in this process of learning, but that doesn't mean they're not going to keep working. And that doesn't mean they're not going to be, working at helping prioritizing place names and all sorts of things like that. So I don't know, Sierra, what your thoughts are on that, but that's kind of what my general, I guess, vibe is from seeing and really admiring some of the work that some of the non-Indigenous people I collaborate with are doing and the way that they kind of carry themselves.
I think you said it beautifully.
We do have one more question from the chat, and it's from Diane. So the question is, how do folks deal with a lack of feedback in print and online media? Perhaps I'm lucky not to get negative feedback, but it makes one wonder, is feedback an indicator of engagement? Does that question make sense to you all? Or we could ask Diane to unmute and maybe explain. Oh, you got it? Okay, do you want to take it away, Will? You want to tackle that?
Sure, yeah. I can relate to that because there are definitely times when I've wondered the same exact thing. Like I haven't really gotten any feedback on this reporting besides from my colleagues. Like, are people consuming it or not? And so I guess in terms of how do you deal with it? You can deal with it in a number of ways. The first thing you could do is directly go out and seek that feedback a little bit more proactively, whether it's via social media or on your platform, actually directly inviting that feedback. I'm personally not a huge fan of at least unmoderated comment sections on news stories, particularly stories about scientific issues, especially ones that tend to have that for whatever reasons have become controversial in some circles. I'm thinking like climate change or vaccines or COVID in general. I think it's comment sections can be really interesting and really can be a distraction, I guess, from understanding the reporting or the science that's informing whatever reporting you're working on. But I guess I'm lucky at public media in that WPR and PBS Wisconsin both collect a lot of feedback from audiences. A lot of that feedback is based on broadcast production, so stuff that they hear on the radio or see on TV, but quite a growing amount of that feedback is related to online digital content. And our really awesome audience services staff collects all that feedback and enters it into a spreadsheet and shares that spreadsheet out with the whole organization every 2 weeks. And that feedback comes to us pretty unfiltered, and sometimes it's it's pretty astonishing, some of the feedback that we receive. But at the same time, I think there is some value in at least understanding where at least the louder segments of your audience, the people who are more willing to give feedback, like where they stand, and what they're thinking about and how they're reacting to what you're producing. At the same time, I don't necessarily recommend using feedback to inform your reporting priorities or whatnot, unless at least like carte blanche. Like, of course, on a case-by-case basis, if you have feedback that you think is really pertinent to your reporting, or has really helped you understand your audience a little bit better, like, of course, internalize that and use it in your future reporting. But don't necessarily think that you have to engage with like every kind of off the wall comment that you receive based on your reporting.
We've all seen some, I'll just say, exciting comment sections on different things. Yeah.
I'll just add that I know how it feels when you like toss something out into the world and you just feel there are crickets. Sometimes it's a blessing to not end up in the middle of the chaos of the comment section, or, you know, where people are, where something you've created is being, you know, globbed onto by an audience and spun around and it's in a tornado. Like, this is not always great. But I will just say that, you know, I could spend so much time looking at the data I get from the podcast. It's super specific. I know down to the second how many people stop listening at a certain moment. And, you know, I could spend a lot of time doing that. I don't, because I know why I'm making what I'm making, and I know what I'm trying to communicate. And so I just have to sort of stick with that. And, you know, and also to remind myself that, like, say 20 people dropped off at a certain comment I made, but 3 stuck around. Those might be people who stick around and like take on an initiative to do something that's better for the lakes. Right. So I think like the value of the response, like, you never really know who you're impacting and how. And so I just sort of trust that even if things are quiet, you know, say 2 people check something out, that maybe those are 2 people that this actually really impacted.
Mm. Yeah. Or one creep finds you on your personal Twitter and asks you to join a panel in like 6 months.
It was not creepy at all.
Well, I just want to ask our audience, because we are kind of coming up on time, if you'd like to share in chat one like takeaway from today or an insight that you found particularly helpful from the panel. And I'd also like to offer to the panelists, if you all wanted to share just like one, you know, takeaway, take home, even if it's something you've already said today, feel free. I know this is, again, kind of putting everybody on the spot, participants and panelists alike, but if you have like one final parting word of advice for our coastal folks, I'd appreciate it. I guess we could just go around. If anybody's ready, feel free to unmute yourself.
I'll go first. I can just say, like, in an increasingly disconnected world and in the middle of a global pandemic where people are feeling isolated, I think that there's never been a better time for stories that connect us. And that's my personal approach to storytelling, is, you know, one person with a story. And that's really powerful. And so when you're thinking about how to craft a story, or when you're pitching a story, if you're thinking about connection and people connect with other people, and that's sort of your guiding principle, then it'll go well.
I can go next. I think always be questioning and expanding our understandings of everything, whether that's sources, whether that's ways of telling stories, whether that's, you know, ways of building a narrative, all of those things. Always keep questioning it and wondering how we can expand it, make it more inclusive, make it more rigorous, you know, make it more applicable to our lives, as we kind of, you know, like everyone has been saying, are in this very strange time right now. But don't be afraid to kind of keep thinking and experimenting with stuff, because there's so much to learn, and there's so many new worlds that we can be building.
You took mine, Megan. Just joking. Don't really go to your source with this idea of these are the exact questions and road I'm going to take. Sit down and talk to them, get to know them. And for me personally, that's how all of my stories have blossomed, is just starting it off as like a conversation and getting to know them and having the questions kind of arise as you go.
Yeah, I totally echo that. And I would add, like, be willing to like embrace being uncomfortable. There have been many moments as a reporter that I've been kind of in situations where I have not necessarily felt like I am super comfortable, and I think that's totally okay. I think I would, yeah, just recommend that whether you are participating in an interview or pitching an idea that you think might be a long shot, you think that maybe whoever you're trying to contact might not care to hear from you, like just kind of push past that discomfort or that voice that may be telling you to be quieter or to like not push or whatnot. Just be willing to be uncomfortable. I think that's been really helpful for me in a lot of situations.
Thank you all so much for being on this panel and sharing your insights with us. I'm seeing a lot of, I'm seeing several takeaways in the chat of things people are taking away with them. And I just want to give one last plug to our attendees for our future science communication series events. We can get that link in the chat, and you'll get it when we follow up with an evaluation of today's webinar. I know social digital media kind of came up today. That is, I just want to point out, we have a late April session on that. So we can talk about TikTok, which I called TikTok earlier today. So I obviously need to learn more about it myself, but thank you all for coming. This has been excellent. And yeah, we'll see you at the next one, I hope.
Miigwech.
Miigwech. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, panelists.